Bang! The wine glass exploded right beside my head. Sierra lunged at me, her eyes wild like a cornered animal. "Don't you ever say that name. You want to die?" Shards of glass scattered at my feet, but what froze my blood wasn't the glass. It was the blood-stained USB rolling out of my daughter-in-law's pocket. But just a moment later, everything flipped. Sierra curled her lips into a poisonous half-smile. "You think you can interfere? If it weren't for me, your precious Marcus would have been a corpse already." And that was when I realized Sierra wasn't just violent. She was being hunted. And Jonas, the name that sent her into a frenzy, wasn't the only player in this game. If it were you, what would you do when the person living under your roof throws things at you while dragging an entire crime ring to your doorstep? Want to hear the twist Sierra hid for 6 months? Hit follow and comment continue. My name is Leona Graves, 58 years old, dark-skinned, and I spent 30 years in the FBI's Criminal Analysis Unit. I've seen many kinds of eyes in my life, from cold-blooded killers to souls already dead long before their sentence was read. But the eyes of my daughter-in-law Sierra carried a shade I had never encountered before, a silent shadowed terror, as if a darkness was chasing her and only waiting for her to stumble so it could swallow her whole. Sierra, 27, with smooth dark skin, sharp cheekbones, and deep brown eyes that never stopped moving, always flickering toward every little sound inside the house. The first time she stepped through my door, the air in the room changed. It grew thicker, colder. Marcus said she was just sensitive, but what I saw were the signs of someone who had lived too long in the dark. There was a moment when I softly pushed the back door closed, and Sierra immediately stepped in front of me. Her breath came fast and hot, her eyes widening as if something terrible was right behind me. "Promise me," Sierra said, her voice low yet carved into hard edges. "Don't open the door unless I'm home." That sentence made me pause. I looked closely enough to see her hands trembling, the pulse in her neck jumping whenever something moved outside. A normal woman doesn't speak like that. A woman running from something does. But I didn't ask, not then. I started paying attention to the small things Sierra did around the house. Every morning before drinking water or eating anything, she walked from the living room to the front door and pressed a new strip of tape over the doorbell camera. The old strips hadn't even dried yet before she tore them off and replaced them. The indoor cameras suffered the same fate. When I asked why, Sierra answered coldly, "I don't like being watched." But that reaction wasn't meant for ordinary household cameras. It belonged to someone who believed she was being watched for real. Sierra didn't sleep deeply. I knew because every night I heard her footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate. Not the steps of someone getting water or using the bathroom, but the steps of someone checking the perimeter of a house, searching for intruders. She walked along the walls, avoiding windows, and when she stopped before the living room window, I heard her breathing stretch thin like a thread. One evening, just after the sky dropped into darkness, I saw Sierra taping up the last camera she hadn't touched yet. I stepped closer, keeping my tone steady. "Sierra, can you explain this to me?" She spun around. Under the dim yellow light, her face tightened with alarm. Her eyes looked like glowing embers fueled by fear and anger. "The less you know, the longer you live. Do you understand?" The words cracked through the air between us like a whip. I froze for a moment, not because she was threatening me, but because I had heard that sentence in victim interviews. That was a sentence spoken by people who had seen something horrifying, something they didn't want anyone they cared about to get dragged into. Sierra's breathing was ragged, her hands clenching tightly as if holding something from exploding inside her chest. Watching her, I realized for the first time that her fear wasn't imagined. She was truly afraid. Afraid enough to barricade herself in darkness just to protect some secret. I opened my mouth, ready to say something gentle, but the words hadn't formed when a sound from outside sliced through everything. The roar of a motorcycle thundered from the end of the street, the kind of sound that tears the asphalt apart as it rushes toward you. Sierra's face drained instantly. Her whole body went rigid before she collapsed onto the floor, as if someone had pulled her soul straight out of her. Her hands covered her head, her face pale beneath her dark skin, her fear so raw it felt like the air around her was shaking. And in that moment, I understood Sierra wasn't just strange, she was being hunted. And that shadow had just taken one more step toward my front door. That dinner started more normally than usual, if the tension between Sierra and me could ever be called normal. I prepared the stew Marcus liked, trying to keep the atmosphere calm so my son wouldn't be forced to stand between two women who always watched each other with guarded eyes. Sierra sat across from me, holding her wine glass but glancing around the room as if counting escape routes. I looked at her, unable to shake the feeling that the entire house was trembling beneath that thin layer of silence. While getting water, I saw Sierra's wallet slip from her coat pocket and open slightly. A small piece of paper peeked out. I only glanced for a single second, but the name on it stamped itself into my mind like a bright red seal. Jonas. 2 cold syllables that made me pause. I had heard many names in my years analyzing criminals, and my instincts told me this name was the trigger behind all the fear Sierra carried. When I returned to the table, I was still thinking about that paper. Sierra stared at her plate without touching the food, her fingers gripping the stem of her wine glass as if letting go would shatter everything. Marcus tried to talk about work at the shop, but every sentence of his fell flat whenever Sierra snapped her gaze toward the window, then back at the front door. I wanted to break the tightening circle that was choking all 3 of us. I set the glass of water down, my voice light as if asking something trivial. "Sierra, I saw a name in your wallet. Jonas Reed. Is that a friend?" The moment I finished speaking, the air split open. Sierra jerked her head up, her pupils shrinking into sharp points. In that instant, the glass in her hand flew straight at me, along with a strangled, furious shout. Bang! The wine glass hit the wall right beside my head, exploding into dozens of sharp fragments. Marcus shot to his feet, but Sierra had already stepped forward, her breath hot and razor-edged. "Don't you ever say that name. You want to die?" The sound of glass scattering on the floor still rang in my ears as I stared at her. In Sierra's eyes was something impossible to define, a kind of panic pushed to the edge of despair. If I hadn't kept calm, she might have overturned the entire table just to stop me from asking anything more about that name. Marcus grabbed his wife's hand, his voice breaking. "Sierra, calm down. Leona just asked a question." But Sierra yanked her hand away, her mouth curving into a smile so sharp it chilled me. "You think you can interfere?" Sierra spoke slowly, each word dropping like a heavy stone. "Your son is lucky to have me. Stay out of this, or you'll lose him forever." That sentence was a silent, precise blade slicing straight into the softest part of me. Since Marcus brought Sierra home, I had tried to be patient, to step back, so I wouldn't become an overbearing mother. But no one had ever dared to threaten taking my son away. I stared at Sierra, feeling a tremor rise in my chest, not from fear, but from the sudden tearing pain. Marcus looked helplessly between us, unsure who to side with. For a moment, I saw confusion in his eyes, as if he no longer recognized the wife he had always protected. Sierra still stood close to me, her breath harsh, as if daring me to respond. The space between us was only an arm's reach, yet it felt like a chasm. I didn't answer right away. My years in criminal work taught me that silence could cut deeper than words thrown in anger. I looked at the glass shards scattered at my feet, then back at Sierra with an expression no longer driven by mere curiosity. My instincts whispered that the name Jonas wasn't just an acquaintance. He was the shadow behind all of Sierra's strange behavior. I opened my mouth, but Sierra stepped back, one hand pressed against her chest as if trying to steady her frantic heartbeat. Her eyes stayed locked on mine, as if I had just opened a door she had worked for months to keep sealed. The air thickened, and dinner ceased to exist. Only Sierra remained standing there, like a fragile shadow on the edge of shattering. And I, someone who thought I had already seen enough horrors in my life, felt my heart tear at the edge when her final sentence echoed like a dark prophecy I didn't yet understand. After the dinner that exploded because of the name Jonas, I began watching Sierra more carefully. Her outburst wasn't just a burst of temper. It felt like the reaction of someone who had lived too long with a gun pointed at her, where any tiny sound could signal the end of her life. The small details in Sierra's daily habits started stitching themselves together like fragments I had seen in case files of witnesses being hunted. Every fragment led to the same conclusion, and it chilled me. One morning, I opened the kitchen cabinet to find a tea bag when I noticed the drawer below was stuck. When I bent down, I saw it wasn't jammed by utensils, but by a small box Sierra had hidden inside. It contained 5 different SIM cards. 5 SIM cards for a normal person made no sense. 5 SIM cards for someone trying to cut their trail, changing numbers constantly to dodge surveillance, made perfect sense. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of staring at the first breadcrumb on a blood-stained path. The next day, while rinsing vegetables at the sink, my hand brushed something odd, lodged deep behind the basin. I reached in and pulled it out, and nearly recoiled. It was a folding knife, small and compact, but the blade was sharp enough to tear skin with a mere touch. It wasn't the kind of thing someone carried for casual self-defense. It was the kind someone carried only when they believed anyone could appear behind them. I placed it back exactly as it had been, not shifting a single angle, not wanting Sierra to know I had seen it. The more I watched, the more I understood that Sierra lived in a constant state of alertness, a kind of heightened awareness that belonged to people expecting the worst at any moment. And then the clearest mark appeared that afternoon. Sierra walked past the living room holding a small shopping bag. When she accidentally dropped it, I bent down to pick it up and saw a long dark streak on her arm, running from wrist to near the elbow, as if her skin had been scraped against asphalt. It wasn't a simple accident. I reached out to check whether the wound was infected, but Sierra jerked her arm back violently, her eyes blazing as if someone had just pressed a knife to her throat. "Don't ask. Don't touch me." Her voice cracked lips, trembling like she was holding back something she wasn't ready to let slip. I stepped back, sensing this wasn't the moment to push for answers. But the wound spoke for her. It said she had been dragged, she had fought back, she had survived something that was still chasing her. These signs reminded me of countless witnesses who once stood before me, people who had run so long that their breath couldn't catch up. Sierra's eyes held the same chaos. And then one evening, her fear burst open like a dam breaking. We were clearing the dining table when the faint sound of a motorcycle drifted in from outside. Just that one sound, and Sierra froze. The bowl in her hand slipped and shattered. Her face drained of color, her legs buckled, and tears streamed down her face uncontrollably. I rushed to her, but Sierra collapsed onto the floor, hands covering her face like a child torn from a cliff's edge. Her panic filled the room, making my own heartbeat quicken. Sierra sobbed, trying to speak through broken breaths. "He found me, Leona." Her voice carried no hint of exaggeration. It was the voice of someone who had heard too many times the sound of tires skidding behind them while they ran for their life. I knelt beside her, my hand on her shoulder, not to comfort, but to understand the depth of what was dragging Sierra downward, because those words opened a door I had tried to ignore. Sierra wasn't just vaguely afraid. She believed someone real was coming and getting closer. Just when I was about to ask for the name of the person she was running from, her phone buzzed sharply. The screen lit up with a single line, so short it nearly stole my breath. "You can't run anymore." I felt every sound in the house fall silent, as if even the walls understood that what Sierra feared wasn't a hallucination. And whoever was hunting her had just stepped one pace closer. Sierra's phone slipped from her pocket when she rushed out the back door to regain her composure. Just a moment. But that moment was enough for the entire world on that cold black screen to open itself wide before me. I stood in the kitchen with no intention of invading anyone's privacy, yet the notification that appeared made my legs stiffen as if nailed to the floor. The screen lit up just enough for me to see every letter, every dot, every fragment of something my instincts had sensed long ago. "I'm here." Only 3 words, but heavy like metal crushing bone. Below it was an image file loading. I didn't want to look. I knew this could pull me into whatever Sierra was trying to hide. But the photo opened instantly, as if the sender intended it to show automatically. The face of a woman appeared, though no longer whole. Her hands were tied behind her back, deep ligature marks carved into her wrists. Her mouth was torn all the way to the corners, dried blood caked across her cheeks. Her eyes were wide open, as though death came while she was drowning in her final terror. My hand flew to my mouth, nausea rising to my throat. The entire kitchen spun. It wasn't the first time I'd seen something like this. In my years as a legal consultant, I had reviewed far worse case files, but this image wasn't from a file. It was a message, a warning, and it had been sent to Sierra, who lived under my roof. I looked at the photo again, the woman's eyes, the wound at her mouth, the way her hands were tied. Everything in that picture felt familiar. I had read about this style of torture in a federal report on organized crime groups. They always left victims with eyes open, forced to look at death. It was a method used to threaten whoever was still alive. I stood up abruptly when I heard Sierra open the back door. Somehow I managed to hide the panic from my face, but Sierra sensed something instantly. Her eyes swept across mine, then locked on the phone lying on the table. She lunged forward, snatched it up, and the screen lit again, exposing those same 3 words, "I'm here." Sierra turned to me, her expression collapsing. Fury crashed over her faster than darkness. "What did you do?" Sierra screamed, her voice cracking like glass. "You opened my phone. Do you want to get us killed?" I stepped back, instinctive, but my eyes stayed on the terror twisting her face. Sweat dotted her forehead, her hands trembling so violently the phone nearly slipped again. "Sierra, calm down," I said, though my own voice shook. "Who sent that picture? Who is that woman?" Sierra shook her head fiercely, her hair falling in loose strands. "You don't understand anything. You can't touch my life. You're pushing me into the grave. And you're dragging Marcus with me." Tears burst from her eyes, but they weren't tears of weakness. They were the tears of someone cornered past reason. I could feel she was holding something back, something that terrified her enough to break her control. I lowered my voice, letting years of professional instinct steady the air between us. Sierra, I've read countless case files. That picture, that knot, the torn mouth, those are signatures of an organized group. I know what they do to the people they hunt. Sierra froze for a second. Her lips quivered between two emotions, wanting to speak and wanting to retreat into darkness again. You can't tell Marcus about this, Sierra hissed. If you do, he'll come to the door, and no one in this house will live until morning. I looked at her, and for the first time saw not aggression or defiance. I saw despair, the despair of someone who had been hunted long enough to live like the dead. Her phone buzzed again. Sierra looked down, and her eyes widened as if torn open. I saw the sender's name before she slammed her palm over the screen. Jonas. I felt a beat inside my chest stop cold, as if someone had pressed hard on my heart. The man hunting Sierra was the same name that made her lose control at dinner, and now he had found his way to my door. Marcus returned just as Sierra locked herself inside the bedroom, her face pale, as if she had stared straight into a demon. I was still standing in the kitchen, my heartbeat not yet steady after the message bearing Jonas's name. Marcus looked at me, then at Sierra, then at the crack on the floor where her bowl had shattered earlier. The house sank into a silence, heavy as lead, the kind of silence that appears only when the truth is about to break loose. I hadn't said anything yet when Marcus stepped toward me. His shoulders slumped so deeply it looked like he might crumble. He looked at me without daring to hold eye contact, his voice raw and trembling, right from the first sentence. Mom Sierra saw him kill someone. He saw her, and she ran. The sentence exploded through the room. I froze, feeling every suspicion I'd gathered suddenly sharpen into a blade pressed straight into my chest. I asked Marcus how long he had known, but he lowered his head, his hands gripping each other as if hiding something even larger than what he'd just revealed. Marcus dropped onto a chair, pressing his forehead into his palms and breathing heavily. I didn't know what to do, she said. If I knew everything, I'd be dragged in. He looked up, his eyes red. That day, she ran to an old friend's house to hide, but Jonas traced her anyway. I looked at Marcus for a long time. Not in anger, but in the deep hurt of a mother watching her child trapped in a snare he doesn't know how to escape. I wanted to place my hand on his shoulder, but he shook his head, refusing even that comfort. You always ruin everything, Marcus said quietly, but the words were sharp as a blade across the chest. I don't want to lose my wife because of you. I stalled. That sentence pierced the most fragile part of me. I wanted to say I never meant to ruin anything, that I only wanted to save my son from danger. But Marcus was drowning in fear, in love, in the desperation of someone standing between two gun barrels, and he pushed me away to protect the only thing he believed he could still keep. We stayed silent for a few seconds, and even Marcus seemed startled by the harshness of his own voice. He turned away, avoiding my eyes, but his shoulders trembled as if he was holding back tears. Sierra isn't just scared, I said slowly. She knows exactly who he is. Marcus nodded, drawing a shaky breath. He wipes out witnesses, Mom. Anyone who sees him, he kills. Sierra saw him murder someone in an abandoned warehouse. The victim was pied, just like the one in the photo you saw. He swallowed hard. She said his gang erases every loose end. Another piece fell into place inside me, sharp enough to make me sit down before my knees gave out. Every wound, every panic attack,
Every terrified stare of Sierra's matched the precise behavioral pattern of someone being hunted by a professional criminal group. Jonas wasn't bluffing. He had done it, and he would do it again. Marcus stood and began pacing the room like a trapped animal. She said if we kept quiet, didn't interfere, everything would stay calm. But you kept pushing. You kept digging. He stopped abruptly, fear blazing in his eyes. Jonas will come. He won't let this go.
I wanted to ask Marcus more, wanted to know how much Sierra had told him and what she was hiding, but Sierra opened the bedroom door right then. Her eyes were swollen, as if she had spent the entire evening fleeing from nightmares inside her own home. She looked at Marcus first, her gaze a mix of pleading and warning, then turned to me with a face as cold as stone. "What did you tell Marcus?" Her voice was low, sharp, unmistakably dangerous. Marcus moved quickly to stand between us, as if afraid Sierra might unleash something worse than Jonas. "Sierra, I need to know the truth. We can't keep running." Sierra gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Half the truth, you know," she said, eyes locked onto mine, "is already enough to get this entire house killed." I stopped breathing. Her words weren't a threat.
They were an unintentional confession that she was still hiding something deeper, darker, and far more lethal than what Marcus had shared. I asked quietly, almost a whisper, "Sierra, what else aren't you telling us?" Sierra looked at me, her expression flickering. Just for a second, but that second was enough for me to see the fear in her eyes twist into something else, something like guilt or a secret she had buried so deeply. Her blood had turned cold from carrying it.
Marcus turned to his wife, his voice trembling. "What else have you been hiding from me?" A sudden gust of wind slammed against the window, followed by the thud of something hitting the awning outside. Everyone in the room flinched. Sierra grabbed Marcus's hand tightly, shaking like a leaf. "Jonas doesn't just want to erase a witness," Sierra said, her voice cracking like glass under pressure. "He wants to erase the one who once stood beside him." I stared at her pale face. And in that moment, I understood that Marcus still didn't know the most horrifying secret his wife was hiding. Marcus hadn't even asked another question when a knock echoed through the house. It wasn't the timid knock of a neighbor. It was slow, heavy, deliberate, as if each thud was a verdict being delivered. I stood in the kitchen doorway, a chill climbing my spine. Sierra's face drained of all color, and she backed away as if being pulled into darkness. No, this can't be. He's really here?" Sierra gasped, clutching Marcus's arm. Marcus instinctively stepped forward, but I grabbed him back. "Let me," I said, though I wasn't certain I could even hold myself steady. I walked toward the front door. The porch light stretched a shadow across a tall, motionless figure standing like a pillar. When I opened the door, a cold gust swept in, carrying the smell of smoke and a metallic tang like dried blood. He stood there, a scar carved from his ear all the way down his neck, deep enough to look as if someone once tried to rip him open. His arms were covered in dense black tattoos, layered symbols I recognized from case files of the most dangerous gangs across the Southeast. His gray, clouded eyes locked on mine, cold but not empty. Jonas Reed, the man whose name alone had sent Sierra into panic. He spoke first. "I want to see Sierra." His voice was low, rough, like it had been dragged across stone. I stood squarely in the doorway. "If you came here to hurt anyone, you go through me first." He examined me the way someone examines a strange, unexpected barrier, but there was no mockery in his eyes. His head tilted slightly. "You're Marcus's mother." I didn't answer.
Jonas inhaled once, then said something that bent the air around us. I didn't come here to kill Sierra. A statement too heavy, too sharp to believe. Marcus heard the voice and hurried to stand beside me. Sierra hid behind him, trembling like a wounded creature. Jonas glanced at all three of us, but his gaze settled on Sierra. If I wanted Sierra dead, Jonas paused long enough for fear to sink into our bones. I would have done it years ago. Marcus turned toward Sierra, confusion shaking his whole body. I gripped the doorframe, Jonas's words collapsing everything I thought I understood. Sierra whispered, "Go away, please. Go. Don't come near." Marcus lifted a hand, revealing a folded piece of paper. Not a weapon, a photograph. He held it out to me first. "You should see this." My fingers trembled as I took it. The photo showed Jonas sprawled on a concrete floor drenched in blood, a gaping wound across his abdomen like a blade had been twisted deep inside. And Sierra, yes, Sierra was in the picture, her arm hooked under his, dragging him out of a spreading pool of red. Her face was twisted with fear, but her eyes carried a fierce, desperate determination. She had saved him. I looked at Sierra. She was shaking, a tremor pulled from the depth of a memory she had tried to bury. Marcus took the photo from me. "Sierra, you saved him." Sierra shook her head, tears spilling. "It's not what you think, Marcus. I didn't want you to know any of that." Jonas cut in. "She wasn't a random witness. She was the only one in that warehouse who didn't leave me to die." "Stop! Don't say it!" Sierra screamed. Jonas looked at her, not with anger, but with something that resembled pain. Old pain. "You ran from the warehouse after dragging me out," Jonas said. "But the others didn't let go of the scent. They thought you were the last person who could expose them." Marcus swallowed hard. "Which others?" Jonas stepped back half a pace, as if deciding whether to open that final door. He reached inside his jacket, pulled out a crumpled sheet, and tossed it onto the living room table when I invited him in. It was a list of names. Not long, but each one belonged to a member of the Northway Gang, a human trafficking and money laundering syndicate, so ruthless the FBI spent 3 years trying to infiltrate it. "They're hunting me," Jonas said, "and because Sierra saved me, they're hunting her too." Sierra broke down, sinking to the floor. Marcus wrapped his arms around her, though confusion and fear burned in his eyes when he looked at Jonas. I stared at Jonas's scarred face, the kind of wound that looked like death had once dragged a knife across him. Then I looked at Sierra trembling on the floor. Everything inverted. Every assumption I'd made that Jonas was the hunter collapsed. Jonas spoke softly. "She didn't run from me. Both of us have been running together." I stood frozen, the room tilting around me as if gravity shifted. Jonas wasn't the hunter. He was the hunted alongside Sierra. And that meant danger had reached our doorstep far sooner than any of us believed. Jonas sat down on the living room chair like a slab of stone, dropped into a room already thick with fear. Sierra hid behind Marcus, her eyes wet and filled with terror she could no longer hide. I stood across from Jonas, trying to keep my breathing steady, even though my hands still trembled from what I had just learned. But Jonas wasn't finished. What he was about to say felt like the ground cracking beneath my feet. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and said bluntly, his voice heavy as a rock sinking into water, "That USB has enough of his crimes to bury the entire organization." The room tightened instantly. I looked at Sierra, whose face went pale the moment Jonas said it. Marcus's eyes widened in shock. His words hit the air like blunt force, sending vibrations through everything. USB. The USB Sierra carried, the one that fell out of her pocket the other night, stained with blood and suffocating my breath. Jonas looked up at me as if reading my thoughts. "You've seen it already, haven't you?" I nodded slightly, and Sierra immediately stepped back, as though my acknowledgement had pierced straight into her chest. "I didn't mean to," Sierra stammered, her voice cracking as she clutched her stomach with one arm, as if holding something together before it burst. "I just picked it up. I didn't know what it was." Marcus spun toward her. "What USB? Sierra, what are you talking about?" I glanced at Sierra, and when she lowered her head, I saw fear, stretched tight like a string in every breath she took. Sierra reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out the small black USB, stained with dry blood that had turned dark brown. The crusted smear on its edge was like the kind I'd seen on hunted criminals' belongings, not an accident. Blood from someone who had been brutalized right before she unknowingly picked up the evidence. Marcus stepped back, mouth falling open. "Sierra, what's on it?" Jonas stood and walked closer, each step carrying too much past to ignore. "Video," he said. "The moment they executed one of their own for betraying them, they filmed it to make an example, but Sierra picked it up." I swallowed hard. Memories of old case files flooded back like cries seared into paper. Organized crime always circled back, always punished, always erased. Sierra held evidence big enough to wipe out the entire genealogy of the Northway gang. Why was it covered in blood, I asked. Jonas looked straight at me. Because it was next to the body of the man they killed. When Sierra panicked and bumped into a metal table, it fell at her feet. She picked it up. Sierra grabbed her head, shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know it was important. I just thought it was something dropped. I only wanted to run out of there. And because of it, Jonas continued, they see Sierra as the last person carrying evidence, the top target. Marcus held Sierra's hand tightly, though his face had drained of all color. "Dear God, Sierra, why didn't you tell me?" Sierra cried, clutching Marcus's shirt. "Because I was scared," Jonas said. "If I told you, you'd be pulled in too. I didn't want you to die." Marcus wrapped his arms around her, but his eyes flicked toward me with unspoken questions he couldn't voice. I stared at the USB, the blood, then at Sierra. Every fragment, her fear, her injuries, the panic at the sound of a motorcycle, her constant glances over her shoulder, all circled back to this tiny object. "The Northway gang," Jonas said quietly, "kills anyone who touches evidence, and they'll kill Sierra first to seal the loose end." The air thickened. Each breath became a burden. I turned toward the window to avoid the raw agony on Sierra's and Marcus's faces. But what I saw made my entire body go rigid. Outside, under the pale yellow porch light, a figure stood in the yard. A long shadow, motionless, not belonging to anyone inside this house. Jonas turned his head sharply. Sierra gripped Marcus's arm until her knuckles blanched. I felt my heart lurch in my chest. The figure didn't move, but it was staring straight at our door. The figure outside the yard still didn't move, yet the pressure from its presence pushed the entire room into suffocating silence. Jonas stepped half a pace back, as if calculating who it might be. Marcus held Sierra close, but Sierra trembled even harder, as if every layer she had built over the past months was cracking apart. I didn't speak, just stood a few steps away, feeling clearly the unraveling of a woman who had run to her breaking point. Sierra finally slipped out of Marcus's arms and collapsed in the middle of the living room. She hugged a pillow to her chest, head bowed, her black hair spilling forward and covering almost all of her face. But her voice, for the first time, had no sharpness or defense. It broke apart, jagged enough to make my throat tighten.
I pulled Jonas out, Sierra said, her voice hoarse and fractured. I dragged him out of that blood, so he owes me his life. Marcus blinked rapidly, like he couldn't believe he heard correctly. I looked at Sierra, and in that moment, her usual mask fell away. In front of me wasn't the arrogant, defensive daughter-in-law who always bristled like a trapped animal. It was a 27-year-old girl, dark-skinned, deep-eyed, shaking like someone standing at the edge of a cliff. Sierra lifted her head, her eyes blazing red. I didn't want to drag Jonas out. I was terrified my hands were numb. But when I saw he was still breathing, I thought if I left him there, I would die right then too. Jonas listened quietly, his eyes hardening into something unreadable. Not hostility, not anger, but the endurance of someone carrying a debt he never wanted spoken of again. Marcus knelt down in front of Sierra, placing a hand on her knee. "Sierra, since when did you save him?" Why Sierra burst into tears, the drops falling onto the cold floor like each one dragging out a piece of her past. "Because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I saw them stab him. I hid behind a metal cabinet. I saw them leave him there like a dog. I don't even know what I was thinking. I just know my legs moved on their own." She drew in a deep breath, swallowing fear and pain at once. "And I dragged him out of that pool of blood, out of that warehouse. Then they came back. They thought I caused it. Jonas and I ran together that day. A shiver climbed my spine, not because she had witnessed violence, but because she carried this terror alone the whole time she lived under my roof." Marcus held Sierra's shoulders. Why didn't you tell me?" The answer came without hesitation. "If you knew, you'd die trying to stay with me." Marcus froze. The entire room held its breath. Sierra sobbed harder, her fingers gripping the carpet like she needed something solid to keep her from dissolving. "You don't understand. Marcus, you're the kind of man who'd protect the person you love, even if it kills you. And that's exactly why I had to hide it. I had to bear it alone. If you knew, you wouldn't leave me behind, and then both of us would be killed." Marcus's voice cracked, unable to form words. I listened to them as if my own heart were being squeezed. All this time, I saw Sierra as a threat, a storm tearing through my son's life. But now in front of me was a desperate woman trying to keep the man she loved alive by turning herself into a living shield. I stepped back, my hand brushing the table's edge to steady myself. Jonas stayed silent, his hands clenched, as if tying himself to the memory of that brutal day. "Sierra, I whispered from the beginning to now, you ran to keep Marcus alive." Sierra nodded, her face streaked with tears. "I'm not as cruel as you think. I didn't want any trouble, but the more I ran, the closer they got." Marcus wrapped Sierra in his arms again, holding her like he finally understood the fortress she had built. He whispered something I couldn't catch, but I heard both their muffled sobs. I turned toward Jonas to ask what he planned next. But he was already staring at the window, his gaze cutting through the dark. I followed his eyes, and what I saw sliced my breath in half. Headlights from the yard blazed directly into the window, a spear of light penetrating the living room. Jonas tightened his fist. Sierra clutched Marcus, and my heart dropped into my chest. Someone was out there, and they wanted us to know. The headlights still cut through the curtains, cold enough to raise every hair on my skin like an invisible hand was squeezing me. Sierra curled up behind Marcus, and Jonas stood rigid, his whole body stretched like a bow about to snap. I stepped closer to them, feeling the floor under my feet tighten, as if waiting for something to explode.
No one spoke, but all of us understood that this moment was the end of every escape we had made before. The front glass door quivered lightly as if struck by the wind. Jonas tilted his head, his eyes sharpening. Marcus tightened his grip on Sierra, pulling her behind the sofa, but Sierra clung to his shirt, shaking so hard she nearly collapsed. Footsteps echoed from outside, reaching the porch. Heavy steps, each dragging sharply across the concrete. Then another. Slow, deliberate, steeped in the pleasure of a predator, knowing its prey is trembling inside. The door burst open with a violent kick, the frame slamming against the wall with a crack like breaking bones. He stood there tall enough to swallow the doorway. Skin pale like dust, one eye swollen, a black metal band around his wrist that looked more like a torture device than jewelry. The light behind him stretched his shadow long, exactly like death stepping out of the dark. He let out a hoarse laugh, a tattooed finger lifting to point straight at me. Bring the girl out, or I'll take your life. His voice was deep and gravelly, dragged from the throat of a man who had lived beside blood too long. His breath carried the smell of rust and gunpowder. I froze for a few seconds, feeling the entire house shrink around me. But before fear could drown me, Jonas moved. He stepped in front of me, his broad shoulders blocking almost everything, his voice cutting into the air like a blade. You want Sierra? Step over my corpse. The boss narrowed one eye, staring at Jonas with a twisted grin. I thought you were dead. Turns out some idiot dragged you out of the pile of bodies. His gaze slid toward Sierra, and his smile widened, sickening. Sierra let out a strangled gasp as if someone had crushed her heart. Marcus pulled her closer. Jonas didn't turn around, but his shoulders twitched, the kind of tremor that belonged to a man restraining rage too deep to name. I looked at Sierra, then Marcus. Both of them waited for me, even without saying anything. I knew exactly what I had to do. For 30 years, I'd faced the worst monsters this world could spit out. Eyes I only needed 2 seconds to recognize as killers. The man standing in front of me was one of them. Fear surged like fire, then receded in the next second, leaving only a cold, sharp clarity. I stepped beside Jonas, my voice low but loud enough for the whole room. You threatened the wrong person. I've looked into a killer's eyes and fired back. His eyes widened, stunned that the words came from a 58-year-old woman. But I also saw fury rippling behind his stare, fury that curled his lips into a grotesque smile. I like it when the old ones fight back a little. He pulled out something metallic and gleaming. I didn't recognize it at first until the headlights outside reflected on the blade. Sierra screamed, but Marcus held her tightly, dragging her deeper into the room. Jonas took half a step forward, fists clenched, and my heartbeat slammed so violently it felt like it would rip through my ribs. The boss growled and lunged. No hesitation, no calculation, just a blood-hungry beast charging. Jonas pivoted right and shoved me left, but I still saw the blade sweep past his face like a cold flash. Everything happened in under a second. The table flipped, the family frame shattered. Sierra cried out. Marcus shouted her name. Jonas twisted and locked the man's arm with inhuman force. The boss roared, yanking himself free of the hold. I bolted toward the small cabinet by the wall, my hands trembling but my mind sharp. I knew what was inside. I had put it away long ago but never thrown it out. My fingers hit something cold, and at that exact moment, a clatter of metal hitting the floor made me whirl back. Jonas was shoved back nearly a meter. The boss was raising the blade again. But just as he lifted it, cutting through the gasp of Sierra's cries, through the crash of furniture, through the frantic breathing, another sound sliced the air apart. A police siren shrieked outside the front door, sharp as a blade cleaving the night in two. He turned his head, and I knew everything was about to explode. The police siren still wailed at the gate, blending with the screams of the gang boss as officers pinned him to the ground. My front door hung wide open, the night wind carrying the smell of dust, gunpowder, and the lingering scent of people who had lived too long inside violence. Marcus was still holding Sierra tightly, and Jonas sat against the wall breathing heavily, but his eyes sharp enough to monitor every movement outside. I stood in the middle of the living room, feeling like my entire body had just been pulled out of a nightmare and was only now returning to the surface. An officer stepped in the blood-stained USB sealed inside an evidence pouch. He exchanged a few urgent words, then hurried out to help capture the remaining gang members being dragged from the single truck parked down the street. Jonas glanced at the USB and nodded as if all our lives now depended on that tiny object. Once the door closed, I walked to the table where an officer had opened one of the files earlier. The laptop screen glowed with a long list of horrifying videos. I pulled out a chair, my heart beating steadily despite everything. "How many people are in there?" I asked, eyes fixed on the screen. Jonas answered behind me, voice rough. 18 victims, all missing, none ever found. I clicked open a small portion, just enough to confirm the content. Faces, blows, torture, those cold, mirthless laughs. In all my years as a prosecutor, I had seen dreadful case files, but never had such images spilled directly into my living room. I shut the video before it crossed my limits. Standing up, I turned toward Sierra. She covered her face with her hands, her body trembling as if coming down from a fever. But when she finally looked up, something shifted in her eyes. Relief. Sierra exhaled shakily. Finally, it's over. Jonas let out a low, tired laugh. Not over yet, but at least now they can't touch anybody. The door swung open again as officers dragged the gang boss through the living room. His wrists were cuffed, his face streaked with blood, but that twisted smile still clung to him like rot. He turned his head and screamed at Sierra, "I'll come back." I stepped forward, standing tall in front of him. My voice was calm, even surprising myself. "No. You'll stay in prison until the day you never walk out again." He lunged, but the officers yanked him away instantly. Sierra collapsed into a shaky breath, as if that sentence cut the invisible ropes that had strangled her for months. When his silhouette finally vanished through the doorway, I felt a massive weight dissolved from the house. Marcus guided Sierra to the couch. I walked toward them and placed a hand on my son's shoulder, a gesture I had not made in many months. Marcus looked back at me, his eyes red, overflowing with everything he had wanted to say. Then he hugged me tightly, squeezing me as if the ice between us was finally breaking apart. "Mom, I'm sorry, and thank you for not abandoning us." I rested my hand on his back, recognizing the tremor in his breaths. It was the same trembling he had as a child, hiding behind me during thunderstorms. No one is abandoned in this house, ever. Sierra stood behind Marcus, her eyes swollen but softened in a way I had never seen before. No distance, no hostility, no hidden spikes. Just a young woman dragged into the nightmare of monstrous men trying to survive by protecting the one she loved. Jonas pushed himself up, leaning against the doorway. "Mrs. Leona, if it weren't for you, none of us would be alive tonight." I looked at him, once mistaken as the cause of all this.
But now the truth was clear as daylight. The line between criminal and victim can be thinner than we ever expect. You saved Sierra once, Sierra saved you once, and me, I only did what a mother must do. Jonas nodded, his gaze softening. Police continued securing the area, dragging out each gang member in cuffs. Within hours, the entire organization was dismantled. The USB had become the golden evidence, exposing everything, ending the chain of disappearances unsolved for years. When the house finally calmed, Marcus pulled up a chair beside me. Sierra leaned on his shoulder, her eyes quiet but no longer panicked. Jonas stood on the front porch, taking a long breath, like someone seeing a sky that no longer smelled of blood. In that moment, I finally recognized what months of fear and misunderstanding had hidden. My family had returned. Not perfect, not spotless, but honest, alive, and beginning to heal. Night receded slowly, no more headlights watching us. Only the soft exhale of people who had walked through hell and found their way back home. And I understood. Sometimes the thing that seems like disaster knocking at your door is really the moment you discover how fiercely you are willing to protect your family.